Hey, everybody. I'm excited to introduce you to my next guest, Dan Stiver. Dan was the professor who guided me through the wilderness of doctoral level philosophical hermeneutics. It's a mouthful. And introduced me to the Society for Ricoeur Studies, an interdisciplinary affiliation of scholars who study the work of the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur. Both of these contributions ultimately played a major role in my doctoral dissertation, and Dan served as my second reader. So let me tell you a little more about him. Dan taught at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary for 14 years before the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention that drove many moderate professors in their seminaries to establish new seminaries in the late 1990s. Then he taught at one of those new programs, Logsdon Seminary at Hardin-Simmons University, for 22 years until Logsdon's closure in 2020. He's now a faculty member and director of graduate studies for a new seminary startup called Fletcher Seminary. And he's written numerous books and articles. He's an outstanding scholar, but I want to focus on one feature of his career. We talk a lot about Paul Ricoeur in this episode, though I don't think we ever actually mentioned his first name. But anyway, I hope our conversation will prove interesting to listeners who wonder why theologians might bother with the work of a 20th century French philosopher, or, in Dan's case, be a founding member of a society devoted to one. In any case, Dan is arguably the foremost expert on reading Ricoeur from a theological perspective. But more importantly, he's a kind, gentle, generous teacher and friend whose brilliance has served the church for decades. I think you'll witness these characteristics as our conversation ranges over the troubling history of the Southern Baptist Convention, theological education, hermeneutics, Ricoeur, embodiment, and spiritual formation. So, without further ado, here's episode 2 of Theology on the Way with my friend, the Dan Stiver. Dan, it is awesome to get to talk with you. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Likewise.
Yeah, I met you through Fuller. Actually, you were interestingly, my first teacher. I did an independent study for my first course in my PhD program, and I wanted to start with philosophical hermeneutics, and Joel Green said, "Okay, I know a guy," because I was especially interested in Ricoeur. I knew that. I didn't fully know why yet, but I knew that. I knew that, and so I think you taught a course for them before, and you were at Logsdon Seminary at
in Abilene, Texas.
Yeah, in Abilene.
At Hardin-Simmons University.
Hardin-Simmons, yeah.
In Abilene, Texas.
Yeah. And so we did that remotely, and that was my introduction to you and to my deep dive introduction into Ricoeur and a handful of other hermeneutical philosophers, and I've just had a deep appreciation for you and your work ever since then, and thought I definitely want to talk to Dan as I get this podcast rolling. So, so Logsdon Seminary, what are you up to now? Same gig?
Okay, a lot of changes in my life, from being initially teaching 14 years at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky.
Okay.
And that fell apart. The whole denomination, in a way, fell apart. Is from my perspective, those with me, we call it the fundamentalist takeover of the entire denomination.
What years was that?
My whole career there, the controversy was taking place, the conflict, but it took a while for it to take effect and really the takeover to be complete. So I started in 1984 teaching there.
Okay.
And the takeover was pretty much complete in the convention around 1990. And then that's when they got control of all the boards and agencies of the entire convention. And then it took a while to implement changes like at the seminary. And so I was there until 98 and ended up being very involved in it, maybe because I was young and foolish, but I was willing to step out there. So I was like chair of the faculty and on the faculty committee that dealt with the board and the trustees. We started a union and I was president of that. And so was involved with that. And then I went to in '98 to Logsdon Seminary,
Mm-hmm.
which was one of the several new Baptist seminaries begun as a result of the takeover. And of course, the convention, many of the churches that had been so involved in the conventions were the ones that were more or less kicked out or alienated. And
Okay, so Logsdon starts as sort of a response to the
yeah,
fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention.
yeah, and there were several others that started as a result of
So I
that.
guess that would make you guys the moderates, the progressives. How does that
Yeah,
locate?
that was usually the language that was used. We were moderates, the others were conservatives. At one point, there was a group that both got together and agreed on terminology that our group was moderate conservatives and they were conservative fundamentalists.
I'm just imagining an outsider listening to even just this little bit of the story is like, wait, the SBC isn't this monolithic thing that's just
Mm-hmm.
always been the same. It's like there are these interesting internal politics and I mean a takeover. That's really interesting language.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a hostile takeover
Wow.
that was planned and engineered and designed and took advantage of a flaw in the charter of the convention.
That's wild.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so that was an incredible liberation to be able to go to Logsdon Seminary at Hardin Simmons.
Okay.
And interestingly, Texas was one of the only state conventions that was more resistant to the national convention. Because you would think Texas would be very conservative, but they were actually open to women in ministry and not. And maybe this is part of the Texas spirit. They didn't want anybody telling them what to do, so
There it
they
is.
were.
Yeah. I was thinking resistant does sound like Texas. Yeah. Like
Yeah,
we'll
and
have
there was
our
a
own charter.
right. So there was a lot of that, but that made it a really nice place to be, and yeah, really great for about 20 years. And then eventually, and so this is not a surprise in terms of the national climate,
Right.
the sort of these conservative fundamentalist tendencies came to Texas or
Oh,
arose more, became stronger
yeah.
in Texas. And as many schools, Hardin Simmons ran into some financial problems. And, I think genuine financial issues. And then there were theological issues involved. And in a very surprising move without much, well, really virtually any warning, without planning, without consultation, with the seminary and the School of Theology having over a $30 million endowment, doing really well, even by their standards. At the last minute at a board meeting, there was a motion to eliminate the seminary. It was the end of 3 days, late Friday. And as I understand, there's virtually no I mean, everybody was tired. It was bored, Steve. We're ready to go home. And they voted to eliminate the seminary.
Man. I mean,
So,
we're seeing that all over the country in my own tradition, as you know, Churches of Christ. I mean, we actually happen to have another school of theology in Abilene, Texas, right alongside you, neighbors there, and so um
yeah, it's just down the street on the same street,
that's amazing. Yeah,
interestingly.
yeah.
Hmm.
Hardin-Simmons and Abilene Christian University, close neighbors.
Hmm.
But yeah, in our tradition, it's the same thing. I mean, in just uh, the last few months, we've seen the closure of one of our preeminent graduate schools. I mean, they're not spinning it as a closure; they're spinning it as it being reabsorbed into the larger university in a different state. But it's a closure. It's a loss that has everything to do with the same currents that are at work there. And Oklahoma Christian University's graduate school of theology just closed, and I personally have been witness to a number of positions, faculty positions, sort of disappearing into the ether because of funding and institutional issues. And so, yeah, that's like, in a way, it's not surprising, but it's also horrifying if you're a theological educator, I suppose.
Yeah,
Uh,
looking for a position is really difficult.
looking for a position, or I mean, yeah, I believe in the role of theological education, sort of in the kingdom of God and for the good of the church, and um, just not sure, like, wh- what that's going to look like going forward. I do have a pretty strong sense that it's going to look very different in the next 20 years. And, I mean, the podcasting is a part of my response to that. How do you occupy the new media space and have at least substantive, meaningful conversations about theological topics? And there are all kinds of other ways to occupy that space. But yeah, I mean, it feels to me like innovation is the order of the day. And I don't know. How do you feel? Like, how do you feel about how all that is going down in your world and your experience?
Uh, but one side of it, sometimes I have a complex that, like, the two institutions I've given virtually my whole career to failed in my lifetime. Usually in history, we see lots of institutions rise and
Right,
fall
right.
over time, but to do it right, you, it's not historical later. It's right in my lifetime. That that's sometimes just mind-boggling to me. I never dreamed it could have happened again.
Yeah.
At Hardin
Well,
Hardin
especially as you
Simmons.
say, like strong endowment, good enrollment, things seem to be going well.
Hmm.
But there, you said again, there's this sort of cultural shift going on behind the scenes that drives some of it as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So,
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
so out of that, uh, a group of that were related to Logston, and then have joined with others, have begun a new seminary, yet another one,
Okay.
called Fletcher Seminary, Jess Fletcher Seminary, who was the president of Hardin Simmons and had been president of the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention before that. He was a really great person. And so we've tried to start, initially, it was kind of Logston in Exile or Logston South. It's based in San Antonio, but it's moved to be online and multi denominational.
Mm,
Um, and still has a lot of people involved that have been involved with Logston. I've been very involved with that. An interesting thing about it, though, is what does it mean to start a brand new seminary right now? And what does it
hmm
look like? And so all of these questions you're raising about what does it look like? Does it look just like, do we just repeat what we've done? And the
Right.
obvious answer is no, probably not.
Yeah. But I mean, the forces there are so powerful. It's not just like force of habit. It's our entire vision of what theological education entails and the role of accreditation, and how what even like lecturing is and what coursework is and all that stuff. I mean, what I've what I've seen so far is that almost every effort to innovate has been about how do we take the same thing and put it in an online modality where it's like pretty much still the same thing. And
Yeah.
I think the disruption is going to be deeper than that somehow. But it's hard to know. I don't know. It's hard to know what's needful, and that what helps.
Mhm. There are some, even standing back and trying to rethink from the ground up, and I confess, it's hard for me to break out of patterns I've had for a very long time. I've seen the way it's been done, and often it's the younger ones, I have to admit, that are able to think outside of the box a little more
Hmm.
and say,
Hmm.
what about this, which I really appreciate. There are some things, in a way, you still have to do in a seminary. There's still Bible, there's still Old
Yeah.
Testament, there's still New Testament, there's still theology and church history and some basic things. But thinking about how to put it together, and it looks very different. Like obviously ours would be very small. It's online, so it's a combination of uh, interactive uh, things like we're doing,
Hmm. Hmm.
and purely online forums, things like that. I think most think we should have a very strong practical emphasis, like everything's related to practice.
Hmm. Oh, we got to
Um,
talk about that.
yeah, so that would be down your alley. Practical theology, practical church history.
Yeah.
um, so that's important, and partly because the, one of the advantages is the students can be in their place of ministry and
Hmm.
they don't have to travel. And another side of that is it opens it up to the whole world. Like we have a student in Africa who's interested in being a part of this new seminary and based in San Antonio, Texas.
Right.
Um, a great emphasis now is making it pretty affordable, so as low cost as possible as well,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
very convenient, very accessible. All of those are really big issues. And of course, a new seminary, we weren't fortunate enough. I mean, the ideal would have been someone gives you $10 million, and you're ready to go, but you don't have that. So we want to make it cost effective and very accessible, but we don't have much money either. And they're operating about as cheaply as one could do. A lot of people are doing it for free. People kind of at
Right.
retirement age, and they believe in it and their mission, and so they're basically doing things for free. I'm teaching a course this next semester at the moment for free. Um, so I get paid for one. So adjunct pay. We don't have any full time faculty.
Wow.
And the thing is, we have people all over the place, all over the country, who are willing to teach.
Right.
So in a way, you could say it's incredible faculty resources
Right.
in our climate, in our time now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's definitely an overabundance of qualified teachers with nowhere to teach,
Yeah.
which is, I mean, it's driving the market in ways that I find very frustrating as one of those
Hmm.
adjuncts.
Yeah.
Um, but it's one of the primary ways it seems to me that some programs are surviving, right, by having half or more of their course load covered by underpaid adjunct faculty.
Right. Right.
Um, what's up, everybody? Let me break in for just a moment and tell you how you can support Theology on the Way. However you're listening or watching, please like, subscribe, follow, all that. But you can also go over to theologyontheway.com and subscribe to my Substack. And there you'll get not only updates about the podcast, but also articles that I'll be publishing regularly. And if you become a paid subscriber, you'll get limited access premium content that will be well worth your investment. Thanks for listening and watching. Let's get back to it.
I
Yeah.
remember, just to show it at many levels, I had a colleague at Hardin Simmons who got his PhD from the University of Kentucky. And he told me that 2/3 of all the classes, all the way through the doctoral level, were taught by either adjuncts or doctoral students
Yep.
at the University of
Yep.
Kentucky,
Yep.
which is, a major state university.
Yep.
And that is a huge problem on your end. The other side is there are people are living longer and healthier.
Yes. Yes.
And so you have people kind of in my situation who are at retirement age who still want to be active
Of
and
course.
maybe can, like I'm cheap labor
Mm-hmm.
now, can do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And now part of the problem is many of those are in full-time positions and not planning to retire.
Uh-huh.
I've had many conversations with younger they say, why don't you all go away? um,
Yeah.
and that's kind of a problem too. That's something of a new problem of people just staying in positions for a very long time. And then ever since 2008 and the crash, I think educational institutions basically have not ever recovered
Mm-hmm.
from that. And so schools and all over the place are not hiring like they did. They're not adding. People are staying on, and it makes it, to be a very difficult situation for younger faculty, especially.
Yes. Absolutely.
Now, it makes it possible for a Fletcher seminary even to have a prayer, of a chance of making it because we can operate very cheaply.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I mean, it's like I get it. I think I've said before when I've talked about this, because I mean, I was adjuncting at one school and I stopped because I just like the finances of it didn't make sense for my phase of life. As you said, like
Yeah.
I'm just at a different point. I was like, when you divide the workout by hours, this
Hmm.
doesn't make sense.
Right.
These hours have to bring a little more. And and so it's like, well, that's a bummer because I mean, getting the teaching experience is great. Being able to adjunct is a privilege. I did it while I was writing my PhD, and so it's like it was a great combination of research and writing, and then teaching. But I mean, there were times when I was teaching 3 courses as an adjunct, and so you know, but I think I said when I talked about this with others, it's like if I were in an administrative position, I'm sure I would make similar decisions. I mean, what do? You have a shrinking student body. You have a bunch of tenured, uh, on the scale of things, more highly paid faculty, program overheads. You've done things to try to innovate, and you've tried to update your facility. I mean, you've done all the things that you can to make the program appealing and contemporary and so on, and then you don't have the income from enrollment. So what do you do?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Pretty
I
tough.
I get it. I get it. I don't and so for a situation like Fletcher, I think, well, yeah, I mean that's a great if you have faculty that are willing, and it's a model that makes it possible to continue doing theological education in a an exploratory format. Like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I get it.
Yeah,
Because
there are
there's
not a lot of, I was just going to say there are not a lot of options in South Texas, just the geography of
yeah,
it, that are accessible. We're especially appealing to more minority students, the ones
great,
that aren't going to go to Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University or Bright Divinity School at
hmm
Texas
hmm
Christian, and probably aren't going to go to Abilene Christian University
yeah,
in Abilene. Um, so it's a particular clientele in a
yeah,
sense that we're reaching out to, and there's some there, but it's still an open question. How can you make it work,
right,
and can it be cost effective enough? I think it often just really helps. Like I mentioned, Logson had the School of Theology as a whole, and we used to have 18 faculty, and now there are 2 on site full time,
wow,
and with at that time a $30 million endowment, and I was told recently it's grown up to about 80 million. And so you have that sitting there. That money then is accessible to the rest of the university and helps
Right.
the rest of the university.
Okay.
But it really, if
Not sure.
us,
Not
I
sure that's what
wish
the
we could.
donors had in mind.
I've told for Fletcher, if we could have about 6 million of that, we could go on for a very long time,
Right.
just as an endowment. And
Right.
that's often what it takes, is enough of endowment to make up for probably not being able to rely on tuition
Hmm.
to pay everything. That's the
So,
challenge.
so has it been the same? It sounds like you've been through two exoduses, and I'm wondering if the second one was similar in that there are Texas churches. I would assume probably some Texas churches and Texas donors that are tied to the seminary and the endowment, and might have said, we're going with Dan and this group over here, or has it been a more limited exodus in the second case?
Well, there have been some of those, and the reason this school has been able to go for a few years now and then offer classes just last year, it took
Yeah,
a couple of years to get going
sure.
is because people did give money
Yeah, yeah,
to help it get going, several $100,000. But we can't access the endowment that was at
right.
Logston, and there were questions about whether some of those involved would, maybe end up going to court to
Mm-hmm.
try to get that money out. But I understand when people don't want to go to court
Yeah,
and
well,
go through all of that and the mess of all of that. Um,
yeah.
so I think maybe some of the ones who were involved at the beginning were hoping for more money.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and it's apparent there's some, but really not enough at the moment. So we're in a big fundraising
Mm-hmm.
effort now and reaching out beyond Baptist per se, because it's moved to be pretty straightforwardly Baptist roots, moderate Baptist roots in our terminology,
Mm-hmm.
um, but to reach beyond Baptist and to be
Yeah, yeah.
ecumenical, diverse, to try to make
Bigger
that
tent.
a
Mm-hmm.
feature, make that actually an
Mm-hmm.
advantage, not a
Mm-hmm.
disadvantage.
Yeah. I loved that about Fuller. It
Right.
was such a big tent, an incredible amount of diversity. Yeah.
Yeah, I should mention, besides doing a few things like I did with you, and that's interesting. I didn't know that was your first class for your doctoral
It
program.
was. It was.
That would have been a little scarier. Um, I taught there. Fuller had an extension in Seattle um, that was really. It was amazing to me. I think they had 180 students for a long time with two faculty, two regular faculty who were
Mm-hmm.
friends that had left Southern, and a couple, and they initially went 2 for 1 for the job.
Wow.
And Fuller was not dumb. They said, "Oh, okay," but
Yeah.
and they eventually paid them, both full time.
Right.
But I taught some adjunct classes for them several
Mm-hmm.
times in the summer, short term summer classes, and that always, I think they said there were over 100 denominations represented at Fuller, and the diversity in the classes was amazing. I really
Yes.
liked that too.
Yep. Yep. On the faculty and in the classes for sure.
Hmm.
Although it's been a little reformed. I mean, overall, but
Hmm.
but that's sort of a charming feature. There are always these internal debates, about. But so Joel was, he's a Methodist, and so there there's always this sort of Wesley v. Calvin thing going on
Yeah,
with
yeah,
him as the dean at the time of the school of theology.
yeah. I
Um,
saw that even among the students. That was nice. You usually did have a strong reform side, and then of course on the West Coast and up in Seattle, I think even in Pasadena, you had this Pentecostal
mhm.
charismatic side that was really strong, and then you had Baptist, Methodist, and so on in
Yep,
the
yep.
middle. So it made for really interesting dynamics. And I liked up there they had cohorts
Hmm.
that was really powerful because it forced them all to be very together.
Yeah,
You know?
journey together. I've seen I think Abilene does this now. Lipscomb, their D-Min programs are all cohort based now. So I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they journey together through the whole process. I think it's very effective. Interesting, because I never had an experience like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was the old model for me.
Yeah, and if you can do it, it's really good. Sometimes it's really hard because you have to have enough students to do it,
Right,
and then
right.
life happens to people, and they have to stop or drop out. Keeping them together can be
Yeah,
a real challenge and almost impractical sometimes. But if you can do it, I just saw that it was very powerful, very effective
yeah.
in that setting.
Okay, so I want to get to hermeneutics, and then Ricoeur, and I'm just imagining in the course of these upheavals throughout your career, particularly where fundamentalism is a driving concern on one side, it must have been strange to be sort of hermeneutically aware, because I feel like that's a lot of times what's at stake on a fundamental level with fundamentalist types of thinking, which I'm very familiar with in my own tradition. And I don't know, that's what drove me in one sense. Childhood experiences of that kind of thinking is what drove me to, I'll say, an obsession with hermeneutics. And I guess we should probably say, I mean, I don't really have listeners yet, but for anybody that might come across this, that word means something like theory of interpretation. Um, and so the focus there in theology is on um, the understanding of how we interpret and methods and so on, those sorts of things. But I'm curious, you know, kind of how your career as a systematician engaged with those experiences and those concerns along the way, and what hermeneutics in particular for you has why that's been important.
Yeah, well, you're exactly on target. It's both. It makes sense, in another way is surprising. I think, as you put it, how is it that a French philosopher became that relevant to the ups and downs of Baptist life in the South?
Yeah, yeah,
But sometimes I would lament even that it was very relevant because, well, we've been doing hermeneutics this whole time. We've been trying to
right.
interpret what's going on and drawing on both of our backgrounds to interpret it. I came from a very conservative, you could say fundamentalist, small f, probably.
Hmm.
People weren't that conscious of it, but
Same. Yeah,
that kind of background. And I've had that journey in my whole life. That was where I came to love God and
right.
follow God. And so I have great appreciation for it. At the same time that I've moved a lot, and they may not be that happy with where I've ended up. But I often think they did make the mistake of making me saying you really should study the Bible
Right.
and follow the Bible and follow God first above all things.
Right.
So
Same thing. It was like, the mantra was, "Don't listen to me. Read the Bible for yourself." And I was like, "Okay, I guess I'll
mhm.
do that." And so when I disagree with you, you can't be mad.
Yeah, you shouldn't. So um, I really did think about it a lot, like especially early on at Southern Seminary, and it helped in a way to be understanding more
Hmm.
and to realize how people could come to have such different views, be so passionate about kicking you out. Let's say,
Hmm.
like we had 80 some faculty at the beginning of the 90s, and there were 3 left, I think, at the end that had begun. So it was virtually a wholesale
Yeah.
change, over time. Yeah, so it has really helped to try to understand, make sense of what's going on, and hopefully at some point even have some compassion for people who are very opposed, and to have some grasp of how it could make sense to them, what
Yeah.
they're doing and what they believe. And another side of it is to realize how difficult and how hard it is hard it would be to change their minds.
Right. Right.
And that was sometimes the more depressing part of it,
Hmm.
is once you understand better those dynamics of hermeneutics, you can realize just what sometimes an uphill battle that you face in trying
Mm-hmm.
to get people to move from their pre-understandings, their first naivete, to use
Mm-hmm.
Ricoeur's terms. And for many people, especially in religion, you start with your first naivete and never leave it,
Yeah.
because it's very uncomfortable. I mean, I can change my mind on lots of things and it's not a big deal. But when you talk about changing your mind on significant religious issues, that's a
Yeah.
much bigger issue. And I think a lot of people just they don't want to deal with that. They don't,
Right.
they deal with it in other parts of their lives, but they don't want to deal with it when they go to church. And it
Mm-hmm.
gives a certain security and comfort to not have to critically. The second part of Ricoeur's hermeneutical arc is the critical examination,
Right.
to not ever go there.
Okay. Lay that out a little bit. Like what does the arc look like? You've got first naivete, critical examination. Like what are the components and what's the gist of it? I mean, what's this clarifying for you?
Well, it's one of those things that I'm sure was very simple for Ricoeur when he laid this out in the 70s, as he was really working on hermeneutics. That there, I think it's first descriptive and then prescriptive.
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of what Ricoeur is part of that tradition of where hermeneutics, in a way, grew out of the wedding of the hermeneutical tradition before that in the phenomenological tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So in phenomenology, you just describe what happens.
Yeah.
And in a sense, this happens for a lot of people. You have a first naivete, you examine it, and then you come back to have a third moment where you make a judgment about it. You say, here's my conclusion and here's what I'm going to do with it. And he liked to call that appropriation, which I like because it has this very practical side. Okay, the end of it is appropriation, in a way,
Mm-hmm.
action. At the same time, as I just mentioned, not everybody goes through all of that. So in that sense, it's not always descriptive. It's prescriptive, that you
Mm.
should go through these stages, and maybe beyond even what he intended, or followed up. He threw that out there, and I've just found it so illuminating in theological education and
Okay.
helpful, especially the students and myself, um, because there is this first understanding that people have, they grow up with. And often it's in seminary, or maybe if they're a religion major in college or go to a religious college and they have required Bible classes and other religion classes, then you're thrust into this critical examination,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be very disconcerting, very difficult.
He calls
In
it
my
the desert of criticism, right?
Yeah, and that's the danger, and you see that, I'm sure you have, in theological education. They call it deconstruction,
Right. Right.
is the popular term, and it it can be devastating. It can be destructive. That people are exposed to all these ideas, and you read 10 commentaries on something, and they have different ideas. And what am I supposed to believe? I still get that question all the time. What do we believe, and what is the answer?
Right.
And in our settings, many the their first naivete, the culture they're brought up with, the pre-understanding they bring to all this is they've been taught there is one answer,
Exactly.
and it's a very
The
dogmatic
the
answer.
the question itself reveals something about the hermeneutics at work.
Yeah,
Right.
and so it's even doubly shocking, you might say,
Mm-hmm.
even for anybody who's raised to say, "Oh yeah, there are questions and difficulties." It can still be very difficult. And then Ricoeur, interestingly, in his French context, secular context, he could talk about being caught in the desert of criticism.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking that, to an extent, he's describing textual hermeneutics, and to an extent, he's describing the the Western culture that he's living through in the 60s, 70s, little into the 80s. That is, I mean, French culture has gone through post-modernity 20 years ahead of American culture, and so the dates feel a little different there. But yeah, he's already lived through like the whole culture sort of self-criticizing in terms of its religious understanding and its belief system and all of that kind of stuff. Um, so there's I mean, the deconstruction movement seems to echo that to me, is like, for not for American culture, but for the subset of Christian culture in America, it's like there's this reiteration of the same thing happening. Um, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, yeah. And interestingly, you have the same term. It means a very different context. Deconstruction in France,
Yes,
it's a little different than deconstruction among evangelicals
it
wrestling with
is.
their
It
faith.
is. We
But there's
appropriated the language from the French philosophers, but
but
yeah,
there's similarities
yeah,
too. And
yeah.
I think the way many people receive like the post-structuralists, deconstructionalists like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault is like, well, it deconstructs everything.
Right,
I mean, the main focus is deconstruct, undo everything, question everything. And it can feel like you're leading to a kind of nihilism
hmm,
and absolute skepticism. And I think that's not totally fair to them where they
right.
end up, but it's the way people often see it and experience. And they do have their emphasis tends to be to undo, to poke
For
holes in whatever
sure, for
anybody
sure.
says. And
And there are
yeah,
teachers throughout the country that use them in that almost nihilistic way. Regardless of what a close reading of their works would reveal, there is a tendency there is a direction there, a gestalt almost for the whole country to be a little bit sort of, all we know to do is break it down. What else is there,
yeah. And then
right?
where's the positive? And that's where I think Ricoeur is really helpful as a good
Exactly, yeah.
model and a guide because he's famous for the phrase hermeneutic of suspicion
Hmm.
that you could say comes from that middle moment of critical analysis, and he could do that. And there's a need for that, but he always had this other side, and that's that third moment. There's hermeneutics of affirmation on the other side of suspicion, or some have called it a reorientation after disorientation.
Yeah,
And so I think an interesting thing about the art and seeing the way it plays out is one could say, well, maybe this just happens naturally. You have a belief and then you examine it and then you just gently move to um, a critically examined belief. But it doesn't always work that way.
right,
As he suggests, you can be stuck in the first moment and the second.
right.
And sometimes it can take, in a way, an effort to move to that third stage, which I like his phrase also, where he calls it like a post-critical naivete,
Exactly, yeah.
like
Second naivete.
yeah, going back, not necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater,
Right,
retrieval, recovery, and a new affirmation, and that's not negative. That can be very positive and significant,
Right.
but it can take effort. And I compare it to what's often happens, like when seminary students take preaching and they've taken all the
Hmm.
theology, and then they talk about how it's really hard to listen to preachers anymore.
Right.
Like go to worship service and I'm just examining everything. I'm criticizing them or saying I could do it better. I wouldn't have done it that way, and it makes it where you can't really hear the word of God,
Right.
you know, proclaimed. And it, I know for myself that can take an effort, like a conscious um, intention to set aside the critical side. One could call it the left brain, go more back to the right brain, and then hear it. And the thing is that I think is really rich but nuanced is it's not like you've forgotten everything you've learned, or it doesn't have to be. Now, sometimes that happens. We've always heard that people go to seminary and then promptly forget everything that they learned because it causes problems in their church. People don't want to
Right.
hear all that. But at best, it's not that you've forgotten. It's just in the background now. And
Hmm.
then there's a time you can go back and critique. But to be able to do that, and I remember I had a seminary student, a woman she was going to seminary late in life, and she'd been a band director, and she, had worked with music all her life, and we were talking about these kind of things, and she said that, yeah, she can't appreciate music at church anymore. She said, I can't appreciate music at all anymore
Wow.
because I'm always analyzing it, critiquing it.
Yeah.
So that move to the third stage is so important. And that's so important for theological students. Where can you find conviction on the other side of the critique? And
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that one of the big payoffs of the hermeneutical turn, of which Ricoeur was a primary voice, was what we call epistemological humility, right? We're sort of it's the fallout of rationalism and sort of the modern hubris in regard to how we understand and what we understand, and hermeneutics as a philosophical movement opens that up and sort of lays bare its um, profound arrogance. One of the things that it does, anyway. So it's really interesting to me that um, the critique, the second movement in the hermeneutical arc, is really a function of um, that movement away from that kind of hubris, and yet getting stuck in criticism is so arrogant, right? You don't have the humility then to hear from others who don't have your critical eye, who are not in the same place, the same moment as you are on that journey. So that it's so interesting to me that what should be producing like a fundamental humility about, like, I mean, my critique tells me I thought I knew, and I understand now that I didn't see clearly. There's more to understand, and then that would cause me to go like, I just can't stand everybody else not knowing what I know. That's such a strange, that's such
yeah,
a strange reaction to that, but it
yeah.
happens. It does.
Well, it's kind of like I can't believe that other people um, still claim to know anything, and I know that they don't. I know that they can't. They're not as skeptical as I am. How can that
Yeah,
be?
yeah. So for that third moment for Ricoeur, he actually refers to it, I think, in the book on Freud, as belief after the desert, right? So you come back to belief after the skepticism of the critical moment. But since that's a second naivete, it also it also presents this problem of, like, I can sort of settle in again and not, I don't I'm no I'm out of the desert, I'm not going back there, but it's more of a process, right? It's like,
Mhm.
when I studied Recur with you, it struck me that the arc has to be a circle, right? You have, because the second naivete becomes the new first naivete, and you
Yeah,
gotta go back into the desert, you're not always there, but you can't stop and feel like, "Oh, well, now I've got it all settled," and um,
yeah.
I don't know, is that, like, fundamentally threatening to people? Just to realize that you're always headed back into this disequilibrium or disorientation, whereas
I
you know
I think it is to a lot, not to all. I mean, some people like that, but I think, and especially if you've been nourished and raised in a culture, to avoid that
Yeah,
and to see that as somehow an enemy, as a threat. But as you know, um, you don't have to look that hard at the Bible itself to see that the images of a journey. Abraham, we begin virtually with Abraham, who goes out not knowing where he's going
right.
and wandering all over. And of course, faith is at the center of, of Christian life, and faith has something to do with living in some uncertainty and not knowing everything. Um,
Yeah,
it's a journey. You're not sure where it's going. I mean, that's so much a part of the Bible that it shouldn't be a dichotomy between faith and having that moment
yeah,
or that
shouldn't be.
movement.
I
Um,
love that because I mean, like, I'm calling the podcast Theology on the Way. This is, like, for
yeah,
me, a methodological core. It's like I think our talk about God, our God talk, happens on this process where we're becoming, we're moving to places we haven't been before, and it's in the process of that journey that we say what we say in the form of, theological speech in all of its flavors, right? Worship is theology, and our the way we speak to one another about God is theology, and the books we write, and so on and so forth. That happens on the way, and Ricoeur was a huge part of that for me, like solidifying that. Let's say theoretically, right? Understanding that there's this ongoing process and, like, what that looks like, why it has desert moments, why the journey is sometimes quite barren. And but I had forgotten, Dan. I had forgotten that your systematic theology is life,
mhm,
life together in the way of Jesus Christ.
mhm,
And so that metaphor is pretty important for you too.
mhm.
Like, what work is it doing in your introduction to theology? I mean, it's a big old tome, but what why journey, and what does that mean?
Well, and part of it reflects my journey and probably your journey too, as we've discussed, of moving
Yeah.
from one place and having some rather significant changes. For example, the women in ministry,
Hmm.
it was really huge, and ultimately, I think that's what brought down Southern Seminary, and the
Yeah.
whole convention ended up. I mean, initially it was a debate about the Bible
Hmm.
and often the word inerrancy, and there was an inerrancy conference that was held in the late 80s, sponsored by the seminaries, and they brought the top inerrantists in the world to come and speak, and proponents of both sides there, a lot of seminary faculty. I wasn't there. My father-in-law was there. He was a seminary professor of church history, and leaders of the takeover group. And what they found is the leading inerrantists found common ground with the faculty, who would not use the word inerrancy much more than they did with the leaders of the takeover. And the
Right.
takeover group got very frustrated because they were scholars. they knew the issues, the leading inerrantist, and they carefully qualified
Yeah, nuance.
the term so that it wasn't that different than what the seminary faculty were doing and would call infallibility or dynamic inspiration or something else.
Right.
That they were pretty much on the same page in a lot of ways, but over against the ones who were basically using inerrancy as a political weapon.
Yeah, a reductive definition that you use as leverage that's about something else.
Yeah. And so amazingly, they kind of dropped that after that. And then they
Oh, right.
turned to women in ministry.
Huh.
Became a crucial wedge issue, we would say. So for me, though, I mean, that was a big thing for me growing up to make that shift. And like we talked about, to go back to the Bible and say, well, actually, it's not saying what I'd always thought it said or what I've been led to believe it said. It's different. And then you meet some women called to ministry and hear their stories, which that's important in Baptist life. You're supposed to hear testimonies,
Mm-hmm.
and respect people's callings, things like that. So there have been several shifts like that. So it's very much a journey. But I would say, even let's say you grew up with the best theological training you could possibly have in Christian formation, it's still a journey.
Yeah.
And because there's life and the culture changes, the world changes, like the pandemic came and still, forced all of these ministers and churches to figure out, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
Do we still have church? Do we not have church? And then half the church is on one side and half's on the other. And then it's hermeneutics. Then what do you do? So life happens. So I think the journey, is very biblical and true to life. And it's for me, I find that, I don't know, comforting and exciting in a way. It's lifelong. And part of it, another way of thinking about it is, as I've thought about it, is actually we're dealing with God, not anything simple. We're trying to understand God and follow God. And I like to read sort of popular accounts of science every so often, like
Mm-hmm.
what they're thinking. Are there multiple dimensions and multiple galaxies? All of that kind of thing. And what's fascinating to me about many of them, these top people in the field, and they talk about how much they don't know and how
Mm-hmm.
much there is to figure out and how mysterious it all is, which is very familiar language. And I think, well, they're actually, what they're dealing with is the simplest part of reality, the physical world. We're dealing with God. So we shouldn't be surprised that we're always able to learn things, that there's always more. And that doesn't mean we don't know anything, but it means that there's always more. Let's see what I was going to. Oh, I was going to mention there. Ricoeur usually refers to the hermeneutical art. That's the usual
Mm-hmm.
thing. But I did find a place where he refers to it as a spiral.
Yes. Yep.
And I think what you're saying is right. I think it's better, actually, in the end, to think of it as a continual spiral.
Yeah, I think so too. And I know, Grant Osborne's book, The Hermeneutical Spiral.
Mm-hmm.
I think he wrote that thing in like 90 or something. And that imagery was pretty captivating. It's a different kind of book, but I think credit is due Ricoeur for that idea. He doesn't give it, but I think it's due. I think it's due Ricoeur for that idea. That the just the shaping of it. I think that's one of the things. I was going to ask you about this. How do you relate this kind of philosophical, technical, highbrow thinking to church life? And I mean, I know, like, even with colleagues, you've had to, in the course of your career, explain, like, why Ricoeur, like, why specifically this French philosopher, like, what's the thing here? It's not easy reading. It's not theology. It so what are we doing? But then I've got this deeper question of like, you know, you got me into going to the Society for Ricoeur Studies, which was an amazing experience. I haven't been able to go the last few years, but I want to get back. Um, but I was like telling people in church where I'm going for the weekend. I was like, "You're doing what?" I'm going to the Society for Ricoeur Studies. He's a French philosopher. Uh, you don't want to know. Like, how, at the same time, I'm actually studying these things and thinking through these things theologically, precisely for the sake of the life of the church, right? I mean, for really nothing else than to help the church hermeneutically, help it deal with the inevitability of interpretation, and do that in a way that's life-giving and useful. So it's been a struggle. I'm just curious, for a struggle for me. I'm curious about, how do you talk about these sorts of things, like the relevance of it, or do you just translate it? You don't really divulge where the ideas are coming from.
Yeah, there's a lot of translation. I mean, people, I do mention Ricoeur enough that they
Right.
smile when I do, but there's a lot of translation going on. And in fact, it's kind of interesting. The first book I did on Ricoeur, Theology After Ricoeur,
Yeah, and
was,
let me interrupt you just one second. People watching and listening need to know, like, you've written the book on recurrent theology. Well, two of them actually, but I just your expertise on this I admire so much. It's incredibly impressive, and those books were massively helpful to me. So if you're listening and wondering, like, well, where would I start? I would actually say don't just dive into trying to read a random recur book, because that might be a little disorienting. But Dan's two volumes, and you can tell us the titles of those. That's a good place to start.
yeah, the second one was Ricoeur in Theology. And
Right.
there's a series of books on often French philosophers and theology, and it's in that series, and that may be a better place to start because it's
Hmm.
shorter and
Yes.
briefer. Um, but uh, I was going to say the first one I wrote for myself in a
Hmm.
way as an attempt. I was reading Ricoeur and it's interesting in one of these collections of his essays on religion and biblical interpretation. He, in the preface, he says um, the editor pulled some things together better than he could because he doesn't really see or try to pull everything together. And
Right.
it's kind of an unusual thing about him is he goes off in these different directions and does these incredibly significant works in that field,
Right.
but he doesn't necessarily pull it all together.
Right.
And it raises all these questions. Well, how does that relate to this? And that's where
Exactly.
I was in the 90s, and just trying to say, okay, for one, how do I pull Ricoeur together? And then the
Hmm.
second, of course, my interest was like theology.
Hmm.
What is the significance of this for theology? And I thought it had enormous significance in terms of rethinking theology. I put it then in a postmodern context, after, you could say, the collapse of the Enlightenment paradigm
Hmm.
in the late 20th century. How does one rethink theology in light of all of that? And I thought it's very significant, has huge implications
Yeah.
even for understanding theology.
Yeah.
So that's how that came about, and that was even before the Ricoeur Society started. Actually, after I wrote that book, I was thinking, okay, I've done a lot with Ricoeur for a while. It's maybe time to go some other direction.
Right.
And then Ricoeur died, and then pretty quickly the society started, and to my surprise, flourished. And
Yeah.
maybe it's because I've had such bad luck with institutions. It's one of the things that has succeeded or flourished in a way far beyond what I could have imagined.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Um, I mean, I'm sort of I'm a member, but just as a novice in that world, sort of realizing how expansive Ricoeur's thought was, and how multifaceted, and how people with in all of these different fields, like find in his thinking pivotal pieces of their own understanding. And then you get everybody together, and there's this weird camaraderie about, like, yeah, we're all his student. And I don't know that there are many. I'm sure there are other societies dedicated to philosophers, um, but I don't know that there are many that, I don't know, covered as much as he did for as long as he did. I mean, he had a very long career and life, and was productive all the way up to the end, and just touched and like this pivotal moment of cultural shift in the West. And I don't know, it was very eye-opening to see why indeed his particular philosophy, so to speak, would be so fruitful for theology. Because I don't know, you've got this famous old definition of theology, right? All things in relation to God. And there's a sense in which, like, that's the scope of Ricoeur's thought, is just like architecture and art and textual hermeneutics and memory and imagination, and I mean, just so many different. Somebody's going to get mad at me for not listing other things that that's their areas of interest, but yeah, so much.
Yeah, you can think like in the 70s, he did this major book on the philosophy of metaphor,
Right.
which has, and then he was actually involved with the rethinking of the meaning of parables that was going
Hmm.
on in the American Academy of Religion with a
Right.
number of other people. He has a major essay on that that has been so incredibly fruitful in understanding. It's kind of mind-boggling to think after 2,000 some years there was really getting a better understanding of the parables.
Right.
But I think that really happened,
I do too.
and he was a part of it, that grew out of trying to understand metaphor. And then he did the 3-volume work on narrative. And those are obviously very relevant to understanding the Bible or understanding faith. But just a lot of them, and those were just two of the little things that he did.
Right. Yeah. It's like just
um,
phases along the way.
yeah. And a thing that I, at least I think, as I've thought about the success of the Ricoeur Society and how it has continued and flourished, I thought we'd have these exciting meetings for a few years, and then it would kind of die off, and we'd meet every 2 years, and then and it would probably be a very small group, like some of the other groups. On a philosopher, they're very small, a few people, and it's continued to have a lot of people. And
Yeah.
a great thing, there's a whole younger generation that are in leadership
Yes.
for it and very involved. But I think a thing that worked against him in some ways in his life has worked for him afterwards. And that is, he was so diverse. He didn't have like the one book, like he's often paired with Hans Georg Gadamer, who was the German hermeneutical philosopher. And I think
Hmm.
it is great. Ricoeur from the French tradition, and Gadamer from the German, and that's hermeneutical philosophy. And Gadamer has, though, one book. I mean, if you want to
Yeah.
study Gadamer, it's obvious you go to Truth and Method.
Right.
And that's true for many thinkers. There's one really
Magnum
major book.
opus. Yeah. Yeah.
And you really can't do that with Ricoeur. And
No.
that makes it very difficult. And so a lot of people just, didn't want to start or give up
Hmm.
pretty quickly. But now it's this gold mine of resources and a lot of
Yeah.
work to do that's energizing for people in many different disciplines. So one of the great things about the Ricoeur Society that's different than a lot of societies, it sounds like it's very narrow, but it's actually very broad,
Very broad.
because you have people from all of these disciplines coming and talking together, and actually all over the world.
Hmm.
Now there are sessions in Spanish, sessions in French.
Right.
So you have people from all over the world, and like in creativity studies, one of the things they often say, creativity comes when you're bringing different areas together, different perspectives together, and that's where I think it's been productive and creative, very interesting. So it's not like all of us going to the Society of Biblical SBL, or like we're all specialists on the synoptic gospels or something.
Right.
And there's a place for that. There's a place
There
to
is. Yeah. Yeah.
dig deep, into one area, but this is a place where people come from a lot of different disciplines,
Yeah,
and it
what I
throws it together.
found, I'm going through my PhD program when I start going to the society meetings, and I mean, I'm a theologian, I'm not a philosopher. A lot of the people in the room are philosophers. I mean, um, they're all in all kinds of fields and all kinds of applications, which I think people a lot of times don't understand. That philosophers play these roles in institutions and organizations that are focused on things that aren't philosophy per se. But anyway, they're connected to all these different sorts of endeavors, and so I kind of like, okay, I guess I'll just dance here, so it's fine. Like theologians can be here. There aren't that many of us, but so I'm sitting in these sessions that I'm just going to stuff that's topically interesting, right? That I feel like might have something to do with what I'm working on. And what I find is this unreal cross-pollination. Like it was so um, energizing and challenging to my thought process to listen to these papers and listen to these discussions by people that are in totally unrelated fields to mine, but I don't know, the ways that they're thinking and the approaches that they're taking to their topics and stuff. It was very, very generative for my thinking to kind of be thrown into that once a year and just be like, oh wow, these people are brilliant and they're thinking about Ricoeur's work and applications in all of these different kinds of ways. I found it incredibly helpful.
Yeah. Well, and I think that has struck a chord with a lot of people, and part of the reason for interest, popularity of
Right.
it, because you don't find that all the time. And the thing is, Ricoeur's corpus, his work and his life, does provide some commonality enough that you can you have some common language and concepts and so on, so you can kind of communicate with one another. So you're
Yeah.
not so esoteric from one another. You can come together.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
which
yeah, it's a strange thing, just because you can refer to his concepts and everybody kind of knows what you're talking about, and all you're doing is trying to make the leap with them into whatever they're talking about. I mean, I heard such interesting papers on things that I would have never thought about, but I was able to engage because of that like you said, the shared language.
yeah,
Just seeing the way that
yeah,
I mean, because to an extent, and this is one of my uh, overstatements that just I can't get away from, but everything's interpretation.
yeah,
And so everybody there is engaged in this interpretive process in their respective fields and areas, and you recognize what's happening even if you're not an expert in that particular area.
yeah.
And yeah,
I
it's
remember
it's
one of
it's
the
fun.
most, yeah, one of the most interesting sessions and conferences is we have a lot of people from Latin America, involved. And there was a group doing a presentation, and they were doing it on Ricoeur's last really big book, Memory, History, Forgetting,
Mhm.
which is a huge book. And I think in the States, it's not one that people look to a lot when they go to Ricoeur. It's not first
Right.
anyway. And they, in a way, they were saying it is first in Latin
Mm.
America. This is the book that is now getting our attention. We're really relating to lots of people. And the
Wow.
reason in their context, they're coming from these countries where people disappeared, politically, because of the political strife, people disappear. And
Yeah.
so the emphasis on memory and forgetting became crucial for them. So that was like the book of Ricoeur that really grabbed them. And that was eye opening for me. And helped me see it in a better light, in a different light. But it's an example of kind of how that works. I was at a now it's kind of amazing to think about it, but I was at a conference on Ricoeur in Moscow once, um, and the emphasis there was on Ricoeur and Freud.
Right.
For some reason, psychoanalysis, and I think that related to ideology as well. His work on ideology was big, but I was just struck by the great interest in among the Russians, in Moscow on Ricoeur and Freud, which is not necessarily, again, what people are looking to all the time now.
Yeah.
And now I think I'm not sure I would go back to Moscow right now,
Not
even
right
for a
now,
Ricoeur,
perhaps.
Ricoeur conference. I'm not sure I would, but that was
No,
an interesting
need to
experience.
need to do, yeah. Instead, just stay home and read his stuff on ideology and utopia, and
Yeah,
think about Russia. But
and I would say, on that, I was thinking of that book. That's one of the most interesting books of all of Ricoeur's books for me, and very influential. And it's kind of odd because it's on the Marxist tradition, the Frankfurt School, the ideology issue, utopia. How does that relate to theology and the Bible? But it has so much richness in it, and it's this different language. And the crazy thing, he was doing those lectures at the same time he was doing the hermeneutical arc, he was doing
yeah,
metaphor, he was doing essays on the biblical interpretation and philosophy of religion, and he wasn't using the same language, and he doesn't correlate them in those
it's
lectures.
unfair. It's unfair that people like that exist. I mean, just
And so it's just fascinating to try to make those correlations, and
right.
very enriching, like to me, to think about, okay, utopia, and how does that relate to the kingdom of God or to
hmm
heaven? How does that function?
Well, and there's some sharp relevance these days in American culture in terms of ideology and I mean even to some extent, the the utopian Marxism that still has its place in the university and um, is not unrelated to our contemporary political discourse.
Well,
Good stuff
the
there.
relationship to the church
Right.
life is ideology. And, there are other words for it. We all have our narrative. We have our biases. We, um,
Worldview.
that work our worldviews, yes, which
hmm
would be a
hmm
major view. We have our worldview, the worldview of the Bible,
hmm
um, that are, as people talk about ideology, that's often unconscious. It's behind our backs. It's what
hmm
we think with, not what we think about.
hmm
And again, coming back to these conflicts and controversies in church life and seminary life, university life, that's totally relevant.
Yeah. So embodiment. Can you just for the listeners sort of explain the connection between recur and the idea of embodiment?
Okay. And it's such a rich area. Interestingly, I think it was the theme of, you could say, Ricoeur's first major book, 1950, Freedom in Nature, the Voluntary and the Involuntary. And after that, there was a lot, as other books, emphasis on a lot of other things. Some take it as a turn away from that. And we'll mention that Greg did a great paper at the Society for Ricoeur Studies on this issue, and I agree with your analysis. And then somewhat returned to it in another major book. Some see if there is a magnum opus for him, it's Oneself is Another, where he returned to it towards the end of his life.
hmm
But the thing is, that reflects in a way the philosophical world, the way it went. There was this turn to language
hmm
that was really strong for a long time. And now, in many disciplines, in many areas, there is fascination maybe in some, you could say almost obsession with the issue of embodiment now. And so it's interesting that his first book is now more relevant, pertinent to a lot of people now than it was for decades.
Hmm. Yeah.
And what he did there, and I'm very interested in it, as I know you are, and I like in a theological context, like to think of it as incarnational
Right.
theology. And it's interesting that Ricoeur, because of that early book, um, and other philosophers in France that worked on embodiment, like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Gabriel Marcel, they were called incarnational philosophers.
Right.
Not really in a religious setting, not or a theological setting. It was just because of their emphasis on embodiment. And still to this day, people who work on embodiment go back to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was such a
Absolutely.
major thinker. And Ricoeur mentioned that he saw that book, Freedom in Nature, as something of a sequel to Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology and Perception,
Right.
where he was focusing on perception and it's so rich, that book,
Yeah. Yeah.
still on embodiment. And Ricoeur was wanting to relate it to the will.
Mm-hmm.
So embodiment and willing, and that is just very, very rich. And maybe you might want to say more that Richard Carney, one of Ricoeur's most famous students, and
Yeah.
I think of as probably the foremost philosopher of religion in the United States today,
Yeah.
um, saw this as a kind of break. Ricoeur was doing it, and then he left it, and then he kind of came back. But I think there's more continuity than that. You might want to speak to that.
Yeah. I mean, so this is like a fundamental question from a theological perspective. What does the body have to do with the text? Right. And to me, like, that's why when I come to Ricoeur and I realize there's this sort of internal debate in Ricoeur studies about whether or not his shift to the linguistic and hermeneutical focus on textual interpretation was in some sense just a move away from the body and practice and so on. I just think like it's really hard for me to see that as two essentially different things because for the whole Christian tradition, if you're going to talk about interpreting texts, you are in some sense trying to understand what to do and how to be or what we're becoming, or it is about the body, and because of our theological paradigm, which is at its core the resurrection, um the body is this inevitability, despite the late modern Platonism and all of this stuff that influences the church's popular thinking and imagination about the afterlife. We're still confessionally just going to affirm that the resurrection means the human body, in some basic sense, is what is eternal. And um, and so, how could it be? I'm wondering that the turn from topically thinking about the body to topically thinking about the text is a break, right? And I think actually Ricoeur's own thought about this journey that we go on answers the question, right? It's a continuous journey, and you're not always at the same destination, but it is one single thing. And I think he would characterize it as the narrative, right? So there's this narrative continuity in his thought that goes from body to text to body in very broad strokes. Obviously, we've said there's tons of other things happening along the way, but yeah, I think he has this basic dialectical concern with the relationship between those two things. And even for him, interpretation of texts was about practical appropriation, right? Praxis is a key concern. And now, I admit, and I mean, you might be able to shed more light on this, but I mean, I admit that, you know, the church is perfectly capable of sort of navel gazing in its interpretive practice, right? And just thinking its thoughts and being highly cognitivist. And I think Jamie Smith's work has been important in sort of highlighting that in recent years, that we've got this too cognitive concern with meaning and ideas and right interpretations of texts and so on. But I actually think that's a bit of a distortion of reality, because you can't be anything other than a body reading a text. It's impossible.
Mhm.
And so that's why I
Great,
go to Ricoeur. I
great.
go to Ricoeur looking for this, like, help me understand how to think about this, because despite the claims, it's not brain work. It's body work, and the brain is a part of the body. It's not mind work. It's whole person work, and we're reading as a community that is embodied, full stop. And so that's my, sort of entree to the discussion.
Well, I think it's so rich for a variety of reasons. You could say philosophically and theologically, but just, I mean, your first point is philosophical, biological, psychological, whatever you call it, that we are bodies. And that was Maurice Merleau-Ponty's uh, big emphasis. We're always doing things with our body. And the thing is now, with the help of brain studies, brain scans, and where we can see what's going on in the brain anyway, and in the body, there's this realization that should be pretty obvious, but maybe has not been. There's been this tendency to be disembodied or think of ourselves as disembodied in the philosophical tradition and in
Hmm.
general,
Hmm.
to separate the two, and often separating thinking from the body.
Hmm.
And famously, Rene Descartes thought they were
Right.
two different substances,
Right.
even, and he really couldn't figure out how to, after Humpty Dumpty had fallen apart, put them back together. And now it's pretty clear it's where our thinking is embodied.
Yes.
And another way to put it, often going back to um, the early philosophical tradition with Plato, a tendency to separate the mind from the feelings.
Hmm.
And now we say when we think, we're thinking, we're feeling. It's
Yeah.
still a bodily state, an affective state of the body. And I often think about that, in the tradition, like with the Stoics. The idea was their prime virtue was to be apathetic,
Right.
or apathy, which was literally not feeling. But the assumption was, okay, I'll think and put the emotions aside,
Right.
and then I'll know and I'll be objective or whatever. But the reality is, you're just substituting one emotion with another.
Yeah. Well, and that, I mean, this goes back to the prescriptive descriptive distinction you mentioned at the
Mhm.
beginning, right? But those philosophers, and they're multitudinous and very diverse, but in a great Western tradition that basically, it wasn't doing descriptive work. It was sort of accepting the fact that, descriptively, our emotions interfere with or complicate or accompany our thinking, and prescriptively the idea is, let's let's bracket those emotions. Let's set those
Yeah,
aside so we can
yeah.
think clearly. And I mean, I don't know what you would say. Like, I recognize that there's a sense in which that's impossible. Like you said, you're just substituting one for another. But then there's also a sense in which, I don't know, in a common sense way, you recognize that when you're really emotional, you're not thinking as clearly. And when you rein that in to some extent, you tend to have, more fruitful thoughts. And so, I recognize what compels them to feel and think. There it is, to feel that way as philosophers, right? That their thinking is better when their emotion is mitigated. um
Right. Well, and I think, any great tradition there has reasons for it,
mm,
like the Stoics and Plato. And you're right. I think we know that certain emotions, strong
mm,
emotions,
mm-hmm,
can overcome us. can devastate us. They can also be thrilling.
Right.
They can be enjoyable. Um, and they can lead us astray, and it makes it hard for us, we might say, to be rational, to be objective. So that's real.
Yeah.
That's real. And in that sense, um, the more complex picture, though, is that again, those are certain emotions, certain bodily states, certain affective states. And when, like the Stoics want us to have equanimity, or we would say to be at peace, to be calm, not swayed and buffeted by strong emotions.
Right.
That is an emotion. In a sense, that's an affective state.
Yeah.
Calmness,
Yeah.
peace is
Yeah.
a bodily state.
Yeah, that's good. That's an affective
And
state.
and I think that's where these kind of biological, psychological brain studies can be very helpful, because they really show that. They really show, okay, the body is involved. There's things going on in the brain and so on
Yeah.
that, like, very physically, the amygdala is part of the brain that's involved in fight or flight. And these studies show when people are like chronically anxious and so on, it's very activated. Even something can grow, get bigger. And then when people are able to be calmer, I might say often through contemplative prayer and meditation and things like that, that it's diminished and even can possibly shrink. So, um, so that the peaceful states are an actual state of the body.
Right.
And so we think, when we're thinking, it's a bodily state altogether. And there is something to it when we're doing, we might say, left brain analysis, and it in a way feels like there's not much feeling going on. It's just for thinking. It really is. And I've been interested in some of the studies that show, like when people are anxious and so on, the frontal neocortex, where higher level analysis takes place, is diminished. Also, the parts of the brain that light up when people are imagining get diminished. The parts of the brain that light up when people are feeling compassionate get diminished.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a very, to me, it's very simple, and it communicates a lot, that when we're at peace and not as fearful, which are major Christian theological biblical virtues, what we're called to be, that we can think better, we can imagine better. That is, maybe we can think outside the box, and we can be more compassionate, which also means we think outside of just being preoccupied with ourselves.
Yeah.
So thinking in terms of the body, I think, can open up a lot of things like that.
Yeah. So what's, from your perspective, like what's Ricoeur's core contribution to your understanding of the embodiment?
Well, the amazing thing, and of course he was getting some of this from Maurice Merleau-Ponty, but he already in the late 40s, 1950, was seeing this interaction. He didn't have the brain studies. He didn't have all of that came along later, but he was talking in terms of the voluntary and the involuntary. And the voluntary, in a lot of ways, he was talking about consciousness. And the involuntary is the unconscious.
Including the physical responses of the body that you don't control. They happen.
Yeah, a lot of them we can hardly even be conscious of, even if we try, like how to control our heart rate and our breathing and our lungs. But it's more than that, even the parts that we just, like in terms of skill. I think, as you know, I like basketball a lot, and I've played basketball a long time, but at sports or performance, you can't be thinking about all of it all the time. Actually, to perform well, a lot of it has to be more or less unconscious, that you assume and rely on to work. Like if you're dribbling, you can't be thinking about how to dribble, once you're playing, a higher level anyway.
Right.
Uh, so that becomes, in a way, automatic or unconscious. And he was already seeing that.
Mm-hmm.
So he has this phrase, I think, the voluntary is by reason of the involuntary. The involuntary is for the voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
He does have these phrases every so often that are so rich that he would, little,
Captivating. Yeah.
yeah, aphorisms that he would come up
Uh-huh.
with. And that's a really great one. That points already that there's always this interaction. Another way to put it, I think that's been helpful to me, that comes from George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's books, Philosophy in the Flesh.
Right.
Right at the beginning, they have this statement like, all language is basically metaphorical.
Yes.
All thought is embodied. And there's a third that they say, and they said, because of this, they're relating to cognitive science, cognitive
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
studies. And they said, because of this, 2,000 years of philosophical reflection is over. So it's
Yeah.
very,
Yeah.
it's very dramatic and probably too
Provocative. Yeah. Yeah.
overly dramatic, but it points to something, a shift in the whole paradigm of thinking about things. And I think Ricoeur was already reflecting that, along with some others, of
Yes.
course, but he was already reflecting that and pointing to it. And then he has this other phrase in Freedom in Nature, I think, that is very rich. He calls it a diagnostic relationship, in a way, between the unconscious and the conscious, the involuntary and the voluntary. And I think he's referring to really the way like a doctor might diagnose a problem, because the doctor says, well, how do you feel?
Mm-hmm.
And how does it feel? How does it hurt? Or what are the sensations? So that's coming from um, the subjective, the patient's perception. And then the doctor said, oh, I think this is what's going on in the body that's making you feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
And there's often interpretation going
Right.
on, because it's not always clear. There could be 5 diagnoses. But he called that a diagnostic relationship between this more subjective, experiential side, and then relating it to the body and what's going on elsewhere. That I think is pretty fascinating as well, which is kind of what brain studies do. They're actually very crude, even though now they're so fascinating. But say, okay, this is what lights up when you're being imaginative, this big part of the brain. We can see
Right.
that. But that's very crude compared to what's going on in our imagination.
Right. Right. Yeah. There's an interesting disjunction between those two things, but I mean that's sort of like the difference between cognition and consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
They still don't know exactly how to get from one
Yeah,
to the other.
they might
Uh,
know, like some say, well, can we ever get to the point where we say T fiber 123 is firing and that means I'm happy?
and that means I am.
Yeah, right. And we're not there. We're not there.
No, no,
So
it
there's
doesn't.
a big,
That
big
yeah.
gap. And of course, it's very fascinating to look at this in terms of, as you know, studies of people praying and meditating
Hmm.
and having their brain scanned, and people speaking in tongues, having their brain scanned. It's pretty interesting. Certain parts of the brain light up, certain don't.
Yeah. Well,
It's all embodied. That's the
it
thing.
is. It
It's all
is.
embodied.
It's all embodied. So Lakoff and Johnson's book was pretty significant for me, sort of figuring out what the real relationship between being a body and language is, right? But it was obvious to me that like what Ricoeur was doing was fundamentally the same thing in a philosophical mode, right? They're doing cognitive science and linguistics. He's doing philosophy that leads into embodiment philosophy that leads into linguistics. But I was thinking of this earlier, and I was wondering if you've read John Sanders' book, Theology in the Flesh. Yeah, because just as a recommendation to throw out there for listeners, like this, it's not a big book. and he does a really interesting job of kind of taking the Lakoff-Johnson style of cognitive linguistics and bringing that into conversation with theological method and reflection. So there's a lot going on there. If we're talking about the field of study, right?
Yeah.
There are people working on these kinds of things. It's sort of new territory, new terrain. And in a sense, for me, Ricoeur is like um, a lifetime ahead already, already on some of this stuff. It's like reading him alongside these kinds of more contemporary, scientifically based studies is hugely illuminating. Yeah.
Before we leave Lakoff and Johnson, which is good, and then the Sanders uh, book, which applies it to theology. The Lakoff and Johnson book also makes this point that is I've seen many places in light of what's often called the new unconscious now, that 95% of brain activity is unconscious.
Right.
5% is conscious. And that's amazing. And it's not the Freudian unconscious that's full of like a seething cauldron of illicit desires,
Right.
bubbling and steaming, trying to get out. It's just for us to function normally, we need the brain doing all this work, like say, like in playing basketball or playing an instrument or something like that. You have to have all of this stuff that's going on behind the scenes. So, and the thing is, people could then say, well, does the consciousness matter at all? Well, yeah, it matters. That 5%
Absolutely.
is pretty significant, because that's where we can do ideology critique.
Yeah.
That's where we can do the critical analysis to say, wait, that's racism, or
Yeah.
that's anti-Semitic. I didn't realize it, but yeah, it is. That comes from being able to analyze what's going on in our bodies.
I think it's a different author, but Jonathan Haidt introduced me to the notion of the metaphor of the rider and the elephant.
Yeah.
Right? And the unconscious is the elephant, and it's like you're not actually in control of where that thing goes, but it's important that there's a rider up there,
Yeah,
also
the writer can have
engaged.
influence. They may
That's
have to
right.
pull really hard.
Yeah. I think that's The Righteous Mind, Haidt's book.
Yeah. I've been teaching at Hardin Simmons to speak in an honors course for a long time, co-teaching. We do cultural theory, and the director, probably the last time I'll teach it will be this spring. And for the first time, I'm co-teaching it with the director of the program. He's a psychologist, and we're going to use that book for the first time in the spring.
Yeah.
Jonathan Haidt's book.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
Yeah. I'm
He
looking
came
forward
in.
to that.
He lectured at Lipscomb.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, there was a leadership institute of some sort that had him in.
Okay.
And yeah, and his lecture material was essentially from The Righteous Mind. That was after The Coddling of the American Mind had come out. I went kind of hoping he was going to talk about that stuff, but he ended up talking because he felt like it was a kind of a religious audience. At a Christian university, he went to the well of the Righteous Mind stuff and religion and politics, and I mean it was fun.
Yeah,
It was
right.
really good stuff.
By the way, that psychology professor, even though we've not taught together, but we were asked to do presentations by the faculty and the staff, and then by an interfaith council after the 2016 election. And after about the issue of moral disgust, and how that keeps us from being able to talk to one another.
Yeah.
And of course, people were coming at that like, we're not able to talk to our parents. We're not able to talk to colleagues because we have these differences that we're very polarized. And it changes everything when one moves from, I disagree with you, to you disgust me.
Absolutely.
You nauseate me. Your beliefs
Yep.
sicken me. Okay, then it's
It's a different thing.
It's a
Yeah.
whole different ballgame.
Now, do you know Richard Beck at ACU?
I do. I
Yeah, so
do.
that's one of his areas of expertise is discuss
Yes.
psychology. Yeah,
And he relates it to faith.
he does very much so.
Yeah, he's very helpful. I
Yeah,
drew on
his
his
book
book as well.
Impure. Yeah,
Right.
uh,
Right.
if somebody wants to pick that up, definitely good stuff.
That's really worthwhile.
Yeah.
And it's a very practical way to see the issue of embodiment.
Hmm.
How it relates to faith, how it relates. Of course, I mentioned politics, but it's all interrelated. How it relates to being able to just have conversations with other people when there are these differences at a deep and it's a visceral level, and that affects our thinking. That's the thing; it affects our thinking and how the judgments that we make. It affects our
Hmm.
analysis.
Yeah, like I think you said you're working now on something to do with embodiment in relation to ideology critique and bias.
Hmm.
So walk us through that. What's the
Well, and the thing that I mentioned, because I've done this in a couple of presentations to the Ricoeur Society, and then in some chapters in a book in the Ricoeur series. I guess we should mention that there's a series on the thought of Paul Ricoeur that has like over 30 books now.
hmm. Hmm.
And the um, the initial bad news is we thought ideology was difficult already. The problem, because it affects us, it's often unconscious, it makes it
Right.
difficult. But I think we've tended to think about that as a somewhat still mental thing.
Hmm.
I have my deep beliefs, you have yours, and they affect us. But then when you realize those beliefs are embodied,
Oh yeah, another layer.
rooted in our bones, so to speak, it makes it actually more difficult. Um, that in terms of trying to understand one another and deal with one another, change our minds. So I looked at the issues of implicit bias that's been now widely studied
Hmm.
in fascinating ways, and then confirmation bias.
Hmm.
So we not only are biased in our initial naivete, our initial judgments, implicit bias, but then once we have a view, we hold on to it,
Right.
and it's very
And
difficult.
do things to reinforce it.
And that's where our great brains and minds and really bright people, we're enormously able to rationalize
Yeah. Yeah.
and come up with ideas and ways to defend the beliefs we already have, so we don't have to change. And that has enormous relevance to the church and to our
Yes. Yes.
disagreements, our conflicts, things like
Yes.
that.
Well, and there's the conscious and unconscious component of that too, right? Because there's what we in just sort of common language call blind spots, but it's literally that pre-understanding filtering out stuff so you don't even see it
Yeah,
because it just doesn't fit your schema, and therefore you can't see it. You're literally
yeah.
blind to it.
And the thing is, it's often our initial reactions to things happen before our conscious mind is really
Mm,
engaged.
yeah.
And so now it's possible we can examine our beliefs. I think that's important. Sometimes reading these people, you get pretty discouraged because
Right.
they almost say it's impossible, but it's not. I see
Yeah, there's like
people,
a determinism in it, right? It's
yeah, but I see in college and seminary, I see people change deep beliefs all the time.
right. Yeah.
I've done it. You've done
Yeah,
it.
I've been
So
through
it's not
paradigm shifts, right? Where I mean,
right. So it's not
yeah,
impossible.
yeah. No, that's
But it,
that's actually like the most motivating thing about it is when you have those kinds of experiences, you have those aha moments where everything is different now and everything makes a different sense. It's like that's the point. That's the whole point of theological education, and like we would call it variously in the Christian tradition, like conversion in the first place, right?
right.
And then
What is
transformation.
conversion?
Yeah, exactly. Transformation, sanctification. I mean, like it's a real thing, this kind of change that we're after. And I just can't imagine. I just can't imagine giving up on the possibility that would happen. That's like the driving motivation of for me, like study and preaching and all of the things that I hold dear.
So in a way, that is sobering to realize, okay, it's deeper than we might have even thought. It's
Hmm.
harder than we might have even thought. But understanding it better can help us think about, okay, how do we deal with that?
Hmm.
How do we respond to it? And there are things we can do
Yes.
that can help with that. One of the another book we're going to be using in this honors course in the spring is by Jennifer Eberhaupt, called Biased,
Hmm.
and she won one of the MacArthur Genius Grants. She's actually a fairly young African American woman scholar. She's done a lot of experimental kind of studies,
Right.
but on bias, especially interested in race, but
Hmm.
in general. And she consults with police departments quite a bit, and is pretty sympathetic because she understands how you can have good intentions, and you can end up, just because of your experience and everything around you, be biased unconsciously, and then that affects especially the way you might respond in a crisis situation, right off the bat. And
Hmm.
to help people deal with that and work with it. But one of the things she mentions, like in one of the things that can be helpful in dealing with bias, is just to pause. Like, I think there were these experiments with, I forget the name of it, but like the website where I can't think of the name, but anyway, where you plan to stay in somebody's house.
Oh, Airbnb.
Yeah, Airbnb, that kind of thing. And of course, there can be problems if people think, let's say you're signing on to stay in somebody's house, and right off the bat, you say you're Black.
Right.
And they had some problems with that. But what they found is, if before you ever get to that point, you have a caution and make people pause to remember not to be biased.
Hmm.
It really helped.
Yeah.
Like, just a pause, simple thing like that, to consider, be on the lookout. Now, it might not make much difference for some people who really are biased and they want to be
Right.
biased. But there are
Right.
a lot of people who, I mean, we all know this. People say, I'm not biased. I'm not racist. I would never discriminate. But then we find out, you can do experiments and show, our initial reactions. Oh, yes, we can be.
Right. 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 Well, and
And
it's like it's a perfect example of what they're saying is I would never will to discriminate,
mhm,
right? But the difference between the will and the unconscious self is pretty big.
mhm,
So yeah, I mean, it's like it's important to make those distinctions, right?
mhm,
Because you want to grant the truth of that claim. It's a little obtuse to me to just say, "No, you're actually biased." It's like
mhm,
you're getting nowhere in that conversation because I know I would never will to be biased, but there's a secondary question, right?
mhm.
And that's really helpful.
And I think the idea of implicit bias can be helpful. So that's different than explicit.
Mhm. Mhm.
And all of us are affected by implicit bias in various ways. And I like to think theologically about this, that that's not, I mean, we often react and say, well, that's terrible. Why are we this way? Wouldn't it be better not to be this way? There's something wrong with us. And I'm coming from a theology, a doctrine of creation, and so
Mhm.
on,
Mhm.
that we are in the image of God. We're basically good, but everything about us can be deranged. Everything about us can go off the path. So when you think about it, we probably couldn't function if we had to consciously think through everything at every moment. And we can have good biases. Bias is usually a
Of
pejorative
course.
word, but we
Yeah.
can have good formation
Exactly.
that gets incarnated in us, gets embedded deeply in us, so that our even our initial reactions can be quite good. Rather than being hateful or spiteful, our initial reactions can be compassionate. So we can, Jamie Smith is really good on this, where in terms of like formation, we're all formed in various ways, and we can be formed in good ways. But given our broken world, we're probably all formed in some poor ways at the same time.
Yeah. Well, and so that puts the accent on the intentionality of spiritual formation, right? It's like you, I think a lot of church people and church leaders perhaps treat spiritual formation, and it's multifaceted, right? So that includes a lot. It's a big umbrella, but treat it as though it's the things that the church is supposed to do because the church is supposed to do it, right? Rather than understanding that these are actually the processes by which you transform those underlying predilections and predispositions, pre-understanding in Ricoeurian terms, that has this hermeneutical payout, which is embodied, right? It is embodied in the life of the church as we live out our understanding. And it's I don't want to reduce everything to spiritual formation, but I recognize like that category, which is a little more popular these days, is really significant. Smith is talking about liturgy, right? That's his categories from the tradition he's coming from. But I kind of think spiritual formation captures a bit more, and maybe gets at the language, at least maybe gets at the gist of something that makes sense to church people, you know.
Another term that relates to church people in our context is discipleship. What does discipleship mean?
Yeah, that would be the key term in my tradition, for sure.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Discipleship, not being a status, but a process, a journey,
Yeah.
right? And that forms you in ways that makes you capable, newly capable, differently capable of engaging with God and other and Scripture and so on.
And Jamie Smith is good on pointing out we're all being formed.
Yes.
And you don't have to call, I think of spirituality as everything. And you don't have to call it just spiritual formation. We're all being formed all the time. We're all in, like you say, we're all in a liturgy of one kind or another. So it's just a matter of what kind of formation it is.
Yeah, he's really good on that. And did you read ever his he wrote an article, it was an editorial, an op-ed, I think, but it basically construed American football fandom in these liturgical terms. It's like he just kind of walks through how that's shaping you as a person.
I don't think I read that. I was struck by his one about the mall.
Yes, the mall.
Going to the mall and shapes us as consumers and so on, and that kind of thing. Yeah, I could see that. That's for sure. That's true. And then the other side is he said he knows the evangelical tradition really well,
right?
Because he has this Pentecostal background, and then the Reformed tradition he's adopted at Calvin College and so on. But he says we tend to be very rationalistic and think of people like brains on a stick. That's his imagery, that we're just big brains and they're just little bodies. And there's a lot of that even in the spiritual tradition. Denigration of the body, denigration of the world, denigration of this life, and trying to get away from it. That's the way to be spiritual, is to subdue the body, which is one thing, but often it meant abusing the body. That's to be the most spiritual, the ones who do it. So we have a lot of this in our tradition. And so we've, like in the evangelical tradition that he's talking about, there's a tendency to think, okay, discipleship is I learn a lot of information. I learn about the Bible. I've memorized some verses, and it's all good. Maybe even learn a little bit of our tradition, a little theology. And it's a lot, very cognitive way to think of discipleship. But this suggests okay, formation is a much bigger thing. What about, so I've been struck by the idea that emotional intelligence can be taught.
Mm-hmm.
Like IQ can't probably be changed very much,
Yeah.
but emotional EQ can actually be taught and learned.
Yeah.
And that has to do with church business meetings. Like, how do we discuss difficult issues in church that often, as we all know, can go very badly?
Yeah.
But shouldn't we be teaching emotional intelligence to our children and youth and adults?
Yes. Yes. That the spirituality of hermeneutics is how I often think of this, and I'm not just limiting that to interpreting the Bible. As you say, I think so much of the life of the church, and that includes, hopefully, we're reading Scripture together and coming to an understanding together as a body, as a community. So much of how that goes has to do with this fundamental level of spiritual formation, of like, are the is the fruit of the spirit operative when we talk to each other in a business meeting, or when we disagree about a decision? um how do we, not what do we talk about, not what do we think, but how do we talk? How do we read? And I'm just convinced that as much as there is a need for, the kinds of understanding that we're after when we're studying someone like Ricoeur, there is also a need for the church to be called to this essential posture in regard to the way that we talk together. My church has been, the church I attend has been, um, just been working through Christopher Smith's book, How the Body of Christ Talks. Really good, really useful kind of primer on all of the different dimensions, and it's theologically framed, and with Trinitarian theology, which is phenomenal. But really dives into the weeds of, like, we just don't have the habits and practices of having a good conversation with one another, like, sane, kind human beings. And so, and it's like, it struck me over and over, Dan, that's like such a travesty that the church of all people would be so bad at practicing things like, say, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness,
Yeah,
faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Like, really? This is so
yeah.
so yeah, more liturgies, more formation. Yeah.
I often think of this time there was a 10-year plan to take over the Southern Baptist Convention that was designed from the outset. And it was successful, very close, but successful. And along the way, kind of halfway through it, every year the SBC would have a theme. Well, this was after all of these statements in the press of going back and forth at each other, like going for the jugular.
Mm.
Sometimes you have to kill the patient to cure the cancer. That was what was said, in the press by leaders. And then the theme for that year, America, God loves you.
Oh, yeah. We can
And
definitely
we were
see that
supposed to go,
embodied.
yeah, we were supposed to go door to door maybe and hand out Bibles or hand out things saying, America, God loves you. Because this was going on. It was um, just distressing and almost humorous in a way. But how we say, the gospel, we have the gospel, and then often, like, they call it performative contradiction, that we say one thing and then we, by our actions, do something that undermines it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's find a positive note to end on. I've kept you for like 2 hours. I'm really, really grateful that you're willing
And
to.
we could go on. You said,
We
well,
can.
what if we don't get done? But we really could.
Yeah. There's
Oh,
more to talk
yes.
about, and we'll have to do it again. Um, what are you most hopeful about right now?
Hmm. Well, there's always hope, and um, I think a lot of church history, there have been down times, and there's always been these movements. Even in the larger picture, I've read some books, one called Abundance and so on, that are really not necessarily religious, but based on studies that and by many measures, we're better off now, the world, than we have been for centuries, even millennia. But we don't see it because our amygdala is activated almost
Mm,
every day by threats,
right.
and so we think things are really bad, and there's reality. There are some really bad things going on, but there has
Sure.
been great change. And then another that comes from this work in the contemplative tradition and the
Mm,
prayer is the realization of that at any time, no matter what, one should be able to rest in what Thomas Merton calls the true self,
mm,
where there is Paul's admonitions, which are very shocking and challenging, to rejoice always,
yeah.
rejoice always. Or Jesus, or Paul saying, be anxious for nothing. Jesus saying over and over, fear not,
Mm,
under the Roman occupation
yeah.
and subjugation of the
Pretty
Jewish
audacious.
people,
Mm-hmm.
that is a possibility,
Mm,
no matter what's going on all around us. And then to trust God is always working. She said the kingdom of God is among you.
mm.
It's the now and not. I was just doing eschatology this week in class. That's what I'm thinking. The now and not yet
Yeah.
side of that. There's always
Yeah.
both.
I was just thinking about that too. I preached a sermon on Sunday, which was, the first week of Advent, so it's hope, and
Mhm,
was just thinking about very similar things, thinking about some eschatology and why it is that we ought to hope.
mhm,
And yeah, I think the incarnation as a token of God's work among us is a really good
mhm,
reason to be hopeful.
mhm, mhm.
Mm.
I agree.
Well, Dan, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for taking the time, man.
Well, it's been very fun, very
It has been.
enjoyable.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to the next conversation. Until then, take care.
Okay, and I look forward to seeing how your future discussions with other people go and how this all works for you. And all the
Yeah.
best for finding positions, your career, and all of that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Bye bye.